morning, everyone, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour. Today is August 3rd, 2023, and we are absolutely delighted today to have Professor Sheila Heen from Harvard Law School as our guest. This program is part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars, which we present weekly. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And in the 3.5 years we've been running these programs, our audiences have been so generous. One of my favorite parts of the program each week is when we announce the running total of contributions to food banks of which we are aware. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
Thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure. Well, the number today is just amazing. $428,265.92 of donations, of which people have told us. And what's most interesting is lately some people have gone back and made big donations to take in for the, 3.5 years, 2.5 years, however long we've been doing this, to be able to bring it current, so to speak, and pay it back big time. So small or big, any donation in any size is appreciated. And then please tell us about it so we can add it to our running total. Thanks so much.
That's fabulous, Jean. Thank you. And now, Professor Sheila Heen is a professor of practice at the Harvard Law School and the founder of Triad Consulting. She's famous in the world of alternative dispute resolution. She is a co-author of 2 New York Times bestsellers. The first is called Difficult Conversations: How to Discuss What Matters Most with Douglas Stone and Bruce Patton. And the second is Thanks for the Feedback: The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well, even when it is off base, unfair, poorly delivered, and frankly, you're not in the mood, with Douglas Stone. The third edition of Difficult Conversations is going to be released this month, and I'm sure we'll be discussing with Sheila, among other things, what has changed in the third edition, and there's a lot of other interesting topics we're going to discuss as well. Sheila is a graduate of Occidental College and Harvard Law School, and she is schooled in negotiation daily by her 3 children. Today, the topic is congruence, the challenge to walk our own talk in how we teach, mediate, lead, and live. Sheila, please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then on with our presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and it's a delight to be here. The food bank that I have selected is an organization that I've been involved in for a little while, a few years. It's the Merrimack Food Bank. So they are located up in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston. And Lowell is a pretty challenged community. And the food bank plays a really important role in supporting particularly women and children, and ensuring that they have the sustenance, food, and support that they need. They are also attached to a project called the Wish Project, which supports other household needs and needs at the holidays. So that is why I chose them.
Thank you.
So when the team reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to do something with us? I thought, sure, what should we do? And I think that there were obvious options like, well, we could do something on difficult conversations. We could do something on thanks for the feedback. We could do something on mediation, whatever. At the same time, everybody attending here, my understanding is kind of on the journey of professionally helping other people with their conflicts. And I think that that's a really interesting challenge. At least it is a challenge for me. And the fact that 24 years ago, we put out difficult conversations, and we've spent the last 3 or 4 years working on a new edition, really going back to the text itself, has been an opportunity for me to reflect on the ways in which my own skills and understanding and self-awareness of all the ways I contribute to my own conflicts, and the ways in which I do and sometimes don't follow my own advice, or struggle to believe truly in my heart that my own advice really applies here, because this is my own conflict and it's just an exception to that stuff that we do for other people. It's been an interesting opportunity to do a little bit of that reflection. The new edition is coming out August 22nd. We are finishing the audiobook tomorrow. Actually, we have to go back to the studio to do what are called pickups, which is just feedback language for things you messed up that we need you to come back and redo. So we're doing that tomorrow. And my own box of them just arrived yesterday. So that is the new cover. As covers go, it works. You always feel a little mixed about your own cover, but so it's been a sense of completion to see it in print finally and done. But it has highlighted for me also the ways in which our own personal growth really has no completion date, unfortunately, which is what I was hoping for. So I don't know if I can share screen or not, but just to kind of put us all on the same page, I can share just 3 or 4 slides for sort of the tools that come to mind for me that I struggle to put in place in my own life and in my own conflicts. Let me see if I can share my screen. We need to reboot a little bit. All right, so can you see 3 bundles of skills?
Yes.
So one of the ways in which we think about how we teach law students and leaders, negotiation skills, mediation skills, conflict management skills, is by thinking of them as bundles of skills or suites of skills that you can organize around 3 different perspectives. So there's skills around what we call the first position. So this is like in grammar, first person. So as myself, to what extent do I have greater or lesser self-awareness of the ways in which my behavior and reactions impact other people? This suite of skills includes the ability to, once I can see something about myself, to negotiate with myself about the priority of my interests, about managing my own emotions and those priorities, as well as those are sort of the internal first position skills, and the external position skills being how well and clearly and skillfully am I able to assert my own perspective clearly and persuasively to others. Then there are second position skills. So this is stepping into someone else's perspective. This is all the empathy stuff. And to really find a place of curiosity, genuine curiosity about someone else's perspective, feelings, interests, priorities. So this includes all the empathy, listening skills, and conversational receptiveness skills. And then, of course, the third position is when you're a neutral observer. How well am I able to step to the balcony, as Bill Urey would say, observe and diagnose what's happening, adjust my strategy accordingly, because I have a bird's eye view on sort of what's going on between us. And this is, by the way, just 2 people. Often you've got 10 people or more involved in terms of stakeholders. How able am I to analytically step out, see what's happening, adjust, and make thoughtful choices about what to do next? So one of the things that has been on my mind is the extent to which I, over the years, have become, and I'm going to make a assumption that many of us all here have gotten pretty good at being in that third chair, right? You walk into a conflict somebody has asked you to help them with, you listen to all the parties, you start to build in your mind and in your notes a picture of the underlying architecture of what's going on. You can really see the ways in which each of the parties is contributing, each of the parties is impacted, each of the parties has good intentions or no intentions or whatever. You can see the ways in which they're telling the story very differently, and see, for one person, this is really about whether you're treating me fairly in the process. For the other person, this is really about whether you're abiding by the commitments that you made, right? And they're just talking past each other because they see this conflict as about different things. And one of the things that's been, I think, intoxicating about being in this field, if I am to use such a term, is once you have these analytical skills, how quickly we can get a handle. Not a complete handle, because there's always surprises and we need to be humble about what we're not yet understanding. We're going to learn as we try to help them with it, but how clearly it can come into focus. And then what I've been really pondering is when it's me in the first position, and this is my own conflict with my spouse or my neighbor or a family member or a colleague, what a mess it still feels like. So it's like, why is it that when I'm in the first position, it's so hard to see and feel the legitimacy of other people's perspectives and to hold on to that, the ability to step to the third position? So that's one aspect of this that I have been pondering, and I'm curious about people's thoughts about. In terms of what helps, partly it's just the awareness, like, oh, right, this feels like a mess because it's me. It's not actually categorically different than anybody else's conflicts. But one of the things that makes it feel categorically different is that there's also an identity thing going on. And one of the easiest pot shots to take at someone is to say, oh, the conflict resolution people can't manage their conflict. Isn't it ironic that you're not being skillful when you're all about teaching other people skills? And it's easy to throw those stones and for others to throw those stones at us. But I think sometimes we throw those stones at ourselves. Like, what is wrong with me? I'm supposed to be able to handle this. And why am I having trouble in the moment reaching for the skills I know I have, but I'm just not using them? I'm just too frustrated, pissed off, venting, triangulating, feeling misunderstood, and feeling conflicted with myself. So I'm not managing my own conflicted feelings as well as I need to get myself to the place I know intellectually I need to be, but emotionally still don't feel. A second tool that's been on my mind here is actually this idea of empathy and assertion not being either or, mutually exclusive, but being two axes. That often when one of the things we say to students is most people will come into the negotiation workshop that we teach stronger on one of these axes than the other. And a lot of education teaches you to assert. A lot of legal education teaches you to assert well. So many people are much better at assertion, and they need to work on their listening skills. Maybe they're good listeners until things get heated, and then the listening skills go out the window and they revert to assertion. But there's also a population that comes in and their strength really is empathy. They're the person everybody comes to talk to. They are really good listeners. They are very slow to share that they actually disagree, to assert their own perspective or interests or feelings. And in fact, they are such good listeners and so good at stepping to second position in listening to someone else in their own conflicts that they can lose track of their own perspective. Like by the end, they're like, wow, I can really see why this is so upsetting. I really see your perspective. And it's only later, after the person walks away, that we think to ourselves, well, wait a minute, I never said that that's not what this is about from my point of view. And so for those students, humans, part of the skill to hone is the ability to make the journey back from I'm good at going to second position. How do I make the journey back to my own perspective, integrating what I've learned to figure out, well, what do I think now? And how do I hold both of our views as essential rather than prioritizing one or the other, either being stuck in my own or prioritizing theirs over my own. This axis suggests that, well, when we're avoiding, we're low on empathy and low on assertion. Some people who are strong on assertion are really clear always at asserting their own view, but over time it can damage the relationships because you always get what you want. You always are quick to say, what's correct or what you're right about. Others then here would be high empathy, low assertion, and they forget to put forward their own view. So they can be very well liked, but unless they have someone else asserting their view for them, they end up being a pushover. And that the goal really is, in any relationship over time, that you've got a balance, and in any conflict, you've got a balance of empathy and deeper listening, as well as sharing how you see it, including how I see it now, that I've tried to integrate your perspective. And I've really been struck by just how complex that can be. So this is just a summary. And the idea is that if you can balance these two things, that's actually even more persuasive. This is aligned with some of the research by colleagues, Julia Minson and others, on conversational receptiveness. That when you signal receptiveness in a conversation, that you're open to persuasion, as well as sharing your own view, interested in the other person's perspective. When you share your view, you do what they call hedging, which is, it seems to me that, or here's what strikes me as still important here, rather than just, look, here's what's true. All the skills that we talk about helping people with in a mediation so that they can each hear each other. When someone signals conversational receptiveness, what Julia's research shows is that people are more receptive themselves. They are more persuaded by what you have to say. They think you are someone who has good judgment, particularly good judgment, because of course you're taking them seriously. So of course you have good judgment. They like you more, and they're more interested in partnering with you to talk about difficult issues. Julia's research actually is done online, engaging people who are anti-vaxxers. And the control group just puts forward their arguments, and the anti-vaxxers put forward their arguments. The test group signals conversational receptiveness and being interested in the other person's point of view, and asking questions about it, etc., and then sharing their own perspective. And then they measure afterwards, when they send a follow-up email to the participants with links to learn more about the perspective that we were talking about. Here are some links for more information. How many of the anti-vaxxers actually click on the links? And when they fill out the follow-up survey, they say, they like the person more, they'd be more interested in partnering with them again, they give them higher scores on good judgment, etc. So I think that this idea that this balance of empathy alongside assertion is persuasive has some really interesting research going on these days. I'll share one more thing, which is just from the difficult conversation stuff. Oh, this is the research, which, by the way, some of you may be tracking that Francesca Gino has been in the news. Julia, I called Julia to say, what is the deal with Francesca's involvement on this study? And Julia said she helped design the design of the study, but never touched the data, just for those of you who are tracking the controversy. These are the findings, which I just summarized. And then the last thing I was gonna just take a look at is some of the things that sit underneath difficult conversations. The first being that the internal voice is key, and that in any negotiation or difficult conversation, one thing that I remind myself about is that I have to remember that I'm really negotiating with what the other person thinks and feels, not just with what they say to me, especially as you become more senior. People will not say what they actually think. They'll do really good listening to you, but they may not speak up. And so I need to make it easier for them to speak up, to get their internal voice into the conversation. And I also have to negotiate with what I really think and feel in many cases as well. And that's sometimes the harder part, to really hear what's legitimate about the other person's point of view and the ways in which I maybe need to modify my view. This then feeds into what we typically are preoccupied with in conflicts, in difficult conversations, which is that our internal voices, as I'm sure many of you know, are preoccupied with our story about what happened, what is happening, and what we think should happen, or the quote unquote facts, which our story includes sub-elements, 3 sub-elements. It tends to be particularly focused on who's right, and in particular, what am I right about? Whose fault is it that we're having this problem, and what's motivating the other person? Under that sit a whole bunch of feelings. I've got to figure out what to do about them. And then identity issues that get hooked. And for the person who wrote Difficult Conversations, and by the way, my husband also teaches negotiation. We met teaching negotiation. So he teaches over at MIT's Sloan School. So, you know, it just gives you it arms you with additional criticisms for each other that you're not actually doing a very good job of listening, just so you know. So how do I make my own transition across to really be focused on understanding why we see this differently? What did we each contribute, including what did I contribute to the problem? Because what's obvious to me is what he contributed to the problem. And just the shame I often feel that's associated with really genuinely seeing my contribution to a problem and the impact that I've had on other people sometimes. How do I understand what's going on emotionally for us? This taps some of Roger Fisher and Dan Shapiro's work on core concerns around autonomy, affiliation, appreciation, role, and status. In what ways are some of the feelings tied to stepping on each other's toes and feeling poorly treated? And the idea also being that by the time we're in conflict or we're in a difficult conversation, typically you've got two problems going on. There's the surface issue, which is what are we going to do about this strategic decision that we need to make? And then there's the deeper issue, which is how we're each feeling treated by the other person. And when we stay on the level of, well, let's just solve the business problem or the surface dispute. And if we don't touch on the deeper issues of how we each feel treated in our working relationship or personal relationship, this problem is going to fester and just re-manifest in a different surface issue next week, because we're still feeling so poorly treated. And then how do I cope with what this situation suggests about me, which is maybe that I'm not as good at this as I should be. I've done things to hurt people. I should have seen that would hurt them. I think that the question of how do I really come to grips with both appreciating how far I've come, because I've gotten much better at this over the many, many years, while simultaneously understanding how much further I have to go. And that's sobering sometimes. So that's maybe 10 minutes of just a little bit of what's been on my mind. But Jeff, you and I talked last night a little bit about your own experience of this. And so I'm curious what reactions or thoughts come to mind.
Well, thank you, Sheila. This is a fascinating conversation. And the thought, I remember when I first read Difficult Conversations, I thought about the distinction between what you're doing and what we think of as classical rhetoric or persuasion. So if we go all the way back to Aristotle, we have ethos, pathos, logos, right? So we have who is the speaker, what is the emotional catch to the story, and then finally we get to the facts, the logical argument. And a lot of legal briefs are put together just that way. My client is a company that employs hundreds of people in the community, blah, 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 start with the ethos. In a difficult conversation, it seems to me that you invert that and turn that on its head, that the facts are the first thing, not the last thing that you address. And then you get to the feelings, and then the identity or the ethos, which is where you would start in a rhetorical exercise to persuade, is actually kind of the apex, or what you're really trying to drive at in a difficult conversation. So I guess the first question that I would ask you is, how do you distinguish in your own mind whether you're in sort of the classical Aristotelian paradigm that everybody else at Harvard Law School is teaching about, how to persuade somebody like a judge or a jury to do something, as opposed to when you're in a difficult conversation, when you sort of have to clear out the facts almost as the underbrush to the conversation in order to get to feelings and identity, which is the heart of it, not just the prelude.
Yeah. Oh, so Rachel Viscomi, who many of you probably know or know of, who runs the Mediation and Negotiation Clinic here. She and I are doing a session at the AALS meeting, and we were having breakfast this morning and talking about crafting that description. And this is exactly what we were talking about, which is, as lawyers, I think one of the things that we're not always grappling with is that being a well-rounded counselor includes understanding when zealous advocacy is actually not what your client needs right now. And to what extent are we teaching our students that zealous advocacy is a really useful and critical set of skills when you are advocating on behalf of your client in front of a judge or jury, right? Who are supposed to be at least theoretically neutral. And so you're each trying to persuade someone, and that someone decides who's right. But much of what we do in our lives is not trying to persuade someone who's neutral. I'm trying to persuade someone who already disagrees with me. I'm trying to persuade my client to actually follow the advice I've just given them, or my partner that this is the right decision to make. And in those cases, that Aristotelian persuasion doesn't tend to help, because it just invites them to push back, right? It turns it into a win-lose, who's going to win the argument competition, rather than what I think is needed in the moment, which is, how do we teach students and ourselves to hold both views as essential in finding a solution here? Whether the solution is just a settlement because we're walking away and we're not in further relationship with each other, or in finding a solution because the two of you need to coexist as business partners, as vendors in the industry. You may be parting ways, but you're in the same community in your industry, for instance, or your geography, or you're still co-parenting, whatever it would be. And if that's going to be the case, each party has to feel that their perspective and needs are as essential to the outcome as the other person's. And that's a slightly different set of skills, as we've all learned, right? It's the skill set that mediators, I think often we become mediators because it has meaning. The work has meaning for us. And the meaning comes from helping people see themselves and each other as more fully human, and seeing the conflict as a problem to be solved rather than a battle to be waged.
And isn't that really, in a sense, what we as mediators, one of the most important things we do, as I find in my mediation practice, is addressing that issue of the relationship between lawyers and their own clients, and the difficulty that lawyers sometimes have, many times have, in getting clients to accept advice that makes perfect sense to everybody except the client. And when they come to mediation, when I talk to lawyers before mediation, it's oftentimes in the utmost good faith that lawyers say, please help me get my clients' unrealistic expectations down to planet Earth.
Totally.
What are your thoughts on what lawyers could do better to manage client expectations along the way, or perhaps prevent client expectations from getting out of hand?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think are the most effective things that we mediators do as third parties to help heal that rift or those issues in the relationships between lawyers and their own clients?
Yeah. Well, I'm laughing because my dad's a lawyer. He's a solo practitioner. He's 83. And we keep saying, aren't you retired yet? And he keeps saying, sort of, because he's always got a couple of clients who are still reaching out to him. He's still working on it. But when I decided to go to law school, he discouraged me from going, which was a total surprise to me. Because, and I said, Dad, I'm a little shocked because I have always had the impression that you really enjoy your practice. And he said, oh, it's great. It's intellectually challenging. It's variety. It's new challenges every day, learning about different industries. It'd be great if it weren't for the clients. And I have now come to, that didn't make sense to me at the time. I've now come to a particular appreciation for that, as you described, Jeff, but also because my dad works with entrepreneurs of small and medium-sized businesses, helping them license their technology, merge, et cetera, advising them, basically being their in-house counsel. And, entrepreneurs are a particular kind of client who don't take advice often. So I get it more now than ever before. But I've also been the client and been frustrated with my lawyer, right? Who I asked to advise me, and they're really not understanding what it is we're asking them to do, or that what they're doing is not helping. So now I've been on both sides of that as well. And I think the question that I have been using recently is, what is it that this person thinks that I don't get? Whether I'm the lawyer, right, or I'm coaching or advising somebody and they're resisting, and it's clear to everybody that I am right, at least in my own mind, it's clear to everybody that I'm right, or that this is in fact reality. And yet they're not seeing it, they're not agreeing, they're not taking the advice either explicitly or implicitly when I circle back to say, have you done that thing yet? I have to ask myself and ask them, what is it that you feel like I don't get about this situation? That being the most common pattern in difficult conversations, which is, I am right about the thing I think that this is about, but that's not what this is about from their point of view. And until I understand what this is really about from their point of view, that's why they're not taking my advice. So what is it that you think I don't get about this? And, you get all kinds of answers from, well, if we give in about this thing, then we're going to get hit with this other thing. Or, we've given in every other time and we just need to take a stand, or whatever it would be. Asking, what do you think I don't get, has been helpful. What's your thought about that, Jeff?
Well, the next question, it's my turn to ask questions. So, so I get to be a little Socratic with you, Professor Heen.
Excellent.
So the degree of candor that you're going to get from somebody seems to me will be directly proportional to the degree of trust that the person has in you. When we come into a situation as a mediator, we've many times never met, never spoken to the clients before, although we may know their lawyers pretty well. And if we're lucky, the lawyer has talked us up to the clients and said, this mediator is really a magician and can really pull a rabbit out of the hat for us here. What are the things that we can do as mediators to engender the kind of trust that I think is necessary to get the kind of candor which will lead to good things happening?
Well, so let's do this. I would love to hear from folks who have joined us, and you can just drop it in the chat if you would like. Because I find the word trust really an interesting question because people use it a lot. And what I'm noticing is that they mean very different things by it. So as I think about your question, how do I get the parties to trust me? It makes me think, what are the questions that are in their head about me that they want answers to before they'll decide whether to be fully forthcoming, right? So one is, do you really understand the world that I live in? So when I walk in in my consulting practice, as I walk into an organization, I'm very aware that the people in the audience are looking at me and thinking, okay, you think you've got a whole bunch of great advice for us. Do you really understand the world that we live in and the work that we do and the challenges that we have? Do you get it? If so, then I'll trust your advice, but I first need to decide whether I think you get it. And you signal that in all kinds of ways, whether that's the language that you're using, that lines up with the language that they use. Do they call them customers or clients or partners or whatever, guests? It's tiny things like that, as well as the examples that you give and the way you engage them to solve their own problems. So one question they're asking is, do you get my world? Do you get what this means for me in my future? When you say it's confidential, is it really confidential? I'm curious because everybody here has experience with parties. What else? You can just drop it in the chat if you like. What else are parties or clients wondering?
Well, while people are putting things in the chat, let me pose one possibility, which is the clients may be asking, are you really here to help me? What is your real job? Is your job just to squeeze on the more malleable party so that there is a deal and you get a notch in your belt?
Yes.
Or are you really here to help me? I know the clients are thinking at some perhaps inchoate level, my lawyer's really here to help me. My lawyer, zealous advocacy, undivided loyalty, fiduciary obligation. I don't know who you are, Mr. or Miss Mediator, or what you think your job is. And indeed, our job is not the same job as their lawyers. How do you deal with that constellation of issues?
And well, I'm going to ask you, Jeff, what's your experience in making that explicit or transparent?
So, okay, I'll let you ask me a question. I kind of think of I do think of the mediator's job as to create the environment in which the lawyers can do the best job possible of representing their clients. And I often draw the distinction, one of the fundamental distinctions between good mediation and bad mediation. Good mediation is where the mediator helps other people do a great job of negotiating. And bad mediation is where the mediator takes over, usurps, or hijacks the role of either the lawyer or the client and starts negotiating for them. Because that, I think, is where the mediator's biases can infiltrate the process and perhaps affect the outcome and do so in a way that might be different than the outcome people would get and the satisfaction with the process, et cetera, that people would get if the mediator were doing the right job, which is helping lawyers do the greatest job they've ever done in their professional lives.
That's a great frame. And it also sidesteps a mistake that I have made in the past, which is that I get an idea that is such a brilliant, elegant solution that suddenly that's what I'm advocating for, subtly or less than subtly. And it can, so not when I was formally a mediator, but within clients, I've been asked, like, look, these two departments can't get along. Can you help them? And so I'm working with them, and it becomes clear to me after however long we're working together, actually, it seems to me you guys have the following strengths, and what if you did this? And especially if I get an initial like, well, that's an interesting idea. That's something that we haven't thought of before. I have enough positive feedback just from that line to decide that I am right. And to decide this is clearly the right solution. and to push for it, and not seeing the ways in which I now have my own agenda, as you say, Jeff, to get the solution that I think should be the solution. Being aware that that's what I'm doing and backing off, getting myself to back off of that, because it's up to them, whether it's their lawyers or the parties, to figure out what the best solution is actually my job.
So as a fellow graduate of Harvard Law School, I too suffer from the affliction of coming up with perfect solutions if only people would do what I say. And I try not to blurt it out. What do you do if you do blurt out such a thing? How do you take it back or get things back on the self-determination track?
I'm on the fence about what I think about mediators offering ideas. I think it partly depends on the situation and whether they have counsel, et cetera, right? Like in the situation I'm describing, it was not a formal mediation, but it was a joint problem solving session of like, how do we improve how these two functions work together? Because the two leaders actually are great with each other, but when they don't agree, it ripples down through the organization. In that case, I think it's okay to suggest ideas, but that they're just ideas that the parties then decide they like or don't like, name or don't name. And I think that when I find myself bringing it back up, like, well, but still, don't you think, or advocating for it, I think that explicitly saying, you know what, guys, I've totally overstepped. I got excited about this idea and I think I need to back off because there are good reasons why it doesn't make sense to you. So either we can talk about those good reasons, or what direction do you want to go to instead? I think that being as transparent as possible in naming that is kind of the only way to get myself to turn the corner. It's almost putting a stake in the ground saying, don't let me go past here because I've already overstepped. So I'm going to name that I've overstepped so that I don't continue to overstep.
There are times I find when things are at a total impasse and there's just no momentum, and I have one of these brilliant ideas.
Yeah.
I've tried to adopt the discipline of saying to people something along the lines of, I have this idea. I don't think you're particularly going to like it. It's not only the best idea I have right now, it's the only idea I have right now. I put it out there not because I think you're going to go for it, but because perhaps it'll stimulate you to think of something even better.
Right.
And, every once in a blue moon, they like what I have to say, but far more commonly, that'll never work, but it does at least get some gray matter working on their part.
Right, because like that won't work because of this, but here's what might work, right? It's supposed to be a catalyst. I like the way that you're framing it. Richard, I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts about trust, because it's an intriguing framing that you've just put in the chat.
All right, well, curiosity is what I was emphasizing, and I meant it to put ourselves in a place where we are really curious, not just in order to get them to give us more information or to feel more comfortable, but to really be curious about the whole situation they're in and to kind of empathize with them that way. And it's hard because we have a time limit, we're being paid and so on, but really to spend some time perhaps beforehand becoming quiet in yourself and then being able to address it from a curiosity standpoint. It seems to me that is a difficult thing because we always have our internal agenda, but I think they will, it's kind of like saying, I don't want to have an agenda, but I do have an agenda. I don't want to say I want them to trust me, but I do want them to.
Right.
But trust is it's like motherhood and apple pie. It's so broad you really can't define it in every situation. But I think that they will pick up, and they do pick up subconsciously or consciously, if you're just trying to sound like you want to be their best friend.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying. That is to me the key to moving the relationship along is to, whether it's your spouse or your child or a party of mediation, is to kind of put yourself in a less judgmental role at the very beginning and be curious.
Yeah. And that idea of what are you trusting me as the mediator to do? What I hope is that you're trusting that if you have something important that you need to have on the table, that I'm going to help make the space for it and help it get heard. That whatever comes up and whatever surprises come our way, we're going to walk through them together to see whether you think there's a solution, right? There are going to have to be a lot of twists and turns. There are going to be a lot of moments where you think maybe I should walk out. I don't know if this is going anywhere. That might be the right choice for you. I'm going to encourage you to, if I think that we're getting somewhere, maybe to trust my judgment for a little bit longer to see whether, in fact, we are getting somewhere on the backside of this, while saying you should also trust your judgment because it needs to be voluntary. And I often think that there are working relationships I have where I would say, I trust them. I trust that they're going to do what's good for them at the end of the day. And I don't mean that as a compliment. Whatever they say, they're going to do what's good for them. So they're predictable, and predictability can mean trust, but it's not the trust that we're talking about. That's motherhood and apple pie. The trust that we're talking about in the best working relationships I have are, I actually know that no matter what comes up, whatever unhappy surprises are ahead of us, whatever fix and foxhole we get into, this is the person I want in that foxhole with me, because I trust we're going to be able to find our way out together. We'll work it through and it will be okay. We'll find a solution. And that feels to me like the deepest form of trust that's earned over time.
I think vulnerability is the key there too. If they see you are vulnerable and that's why if you relate something about yourself, they will get that more than just talking to them about themselves.
I think that that's right. And then what you've made me think about suddenly is, then is that what we mean when we talk about whether we trust ourselves? Because I have colleagues, often young colleagues. I also have a 17-year-old daughter. And I feel like her path right now is that she needs to learn to trust herself better. And maybe it's that whatever fix she gets herself in, she has the capability to figure it out and get out, and she needs to listen to herself about what she needs or thinks. I don't know. It's interesting. Do we use the word differently in our relationship with ourselves?
Sheila, let's turn our attention for a few minutes to the third edition of Difficult Conversations, which is coming out this month, right? And
yes,
it will be available at booksellers everywhere.
Everywhere.
So the fact that you're releasing a new edition, there must be some new and improved portions of it, some places where you've refined your thinking, or there may even be something in the previous edition that you thought was wrong. Who knows? So what led you to put out a third edition of the book? And what is it that you've learned that led you to make some changes?
Great question. So it came out in 1999. Email wasn't really a thing. iPhones had not yet been invented, or were in development, but not visible to us in everyday life. Forget about Zoom. And when in 2010, when we did the second edition, we decided to leave the text alone and to add the 10 questions people ask about difficult conversations. So we added about 60 pages of new content to the second edition. As we were coming up on the 20-year anniversary, just pre-pandemic, we started thinking about, all right, well, maybe it's time to go back and revisit the whole thing. Because I think that over the years I've been kind of amazed at two things at opposite ends of the spectrum. One is how powerful it has been for myself in my own life, and continues to be a challenge, but when I actually can follow the advice, it really helps. And the number of people who I meet who say, like, this saved my marriage, or I wish I'd read it earlier because it might have saved my marriage, etc. So on the one hand, yay, good news. It actually really helps. And then on the other hand, and there are limitations to it that we probably didn't give enough credence to. And so in terms of what has changed is we've updated a lot of the examples. We've swapped out and replaced examples to make them both more current, more complex, and more inclusive. When I sat on a plane, I read the book from beginning to end for the first time in many, many years. And I was struck by who was left out. There were no blended families in the entire book. What the heck? I mean, that makes no sense. It's such a blind spot that I'm sort of shocked about it now. And so to make the book more inclusive, but we also then added content on the limitations. So when might it not make sense to listen? What are some of the costs of listening that might actually outweigh the benefits of listening in some situations? And how do you decide? When is it not appropriate to talk about joint contribution and actually potentially harmful to talk about joint contribution? We then, particularly, it's woven throughout, but particularly in the 10 questions, we rewrote most of the 10 questions. The answers, we added much more on Zoom and text and, social media platforms, etc. We also, 2 of the questions center around the role of power in difficult conversations. And that was a good 6 months of trying to figure out what is it that we think about the role of power in difficult conversations. Because I think we've learned a lot about that in recent years. And this relates back to being a mediator. You have a lot of power in the room just because of the role that you're in and the reputation you bring, because other people have told the parties that you are magical. And so to what extent do people not speak up because of that? Or how do we pass that on to them to empower them rather than have them feel the one downside? So there's a question on what if the other person's more powerful than me? And then the next question is, what about when I'm in charge? Can't I just tell people what to do? And what are the pitfalls and blind spots that we have when we are in a position of responsibility? We experience it as responsibility. Other people see it as power. So those are a few of the things. And so you can see it's a little thicker because we added sections. I think for the good, I think it is more realistic in many ways. And we'll put out a quick 2-pager on if you use it to teach. So I advocated that we should swap the order of the chapters. I did not win that argument. Partly because if you teach from it and you have some people with the second edition, some with the third and whatever, what a mess. So, okay, that's fair. That's a good reason. I'm persuaded.
Good. And what's the next challenge on your agenda, your horizon?
It's a good question. This question about where do you walk to the edge of your own capabilities and self-awareness, and how do you keep moving that edge rather than just falling off of it over and over again, I think is a really interesting question. It's not that other people haven't written about that, but I think that it's a potential. Doug and I also for many years taught a 1-week book writing retreat that was super fun to teach. And we have all kinds of tools that we learned from Roger Fisher, who wrote an MTS about how to organize and write. And the idea that a book is a conversation with the reader. So how do you make that a rich and engaging conversation with your reader, for instance? And so that's a potential side project. Do we turn that into a book? For people who want to capture their wisdom and put it out in an accessible way for other people. So that's on our minds as well.
Fantastic. So let me ask you if you have any last words of wisdom in our remaining minute here. Anything I should have asked you but didn't? Any other trying to make?
No, maybe just the most interesting conversations that I have been in with people that I'm closest to have been about failures. And I think we devote too little time to that as mediators. And that's where the learning potentially is. So that's a practice that we're trying to put into place. We've put into place, but we're trying to amplify in how we're teaching, working with students and working with clients. So it's an invitation to everyone to go talk about your failures with each other.
Failures in mediations or more generally?
Well, in mediations for sure, because that's
Uh-huh.
certainly where we have things to learn. But it's the places where we stumble or get stuck, where it just feels like, well, the other person was just impossible. That are like, okay, well, what didn't I see? Why didn't I see that earlier? One of my patterns, failure patterns, is that I hold on too long to hope, thinking things will change when it becomes very clear that we've pretty much tried everything, and recognizing that in myself.
Can you think of an example of that?
Well, I have examples in my dating life from many, many years ago, if we would like to go there. Like, it's just not working. It's not going to change in the ways that one of us needs it or both of us need it to change. So we should call it.
Uh-huh.
Those are easy examples to point to, right? Yeah.
And Sheila, don't you also think that for mediators, sometimes if the case settles, we tend not to be introspective about those situations. We just say, well, it's settled. So
Right, exactly.
everything must have been totally hunky-dory. And just as we can learn from the cases which don't settle, which I don't
Yes.
think is a sine qua non of failure, it's not a synonym for failure. The fact that a case settles also does not necessarily mean that we did an A+ job as mediator. We can learn from every situation in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I think that that's a really beautiful place to wrap, because it really feels true in my experience.
Well, Sheila, this has been an extraordinary conversation. Everything I thought it would be. Thank you so much for being our guest here on the New Possibilities Hour. It's part of the Will Work for Food project. I know I'll be contributing to the Merrimack Valley Food Bank in your honor, and I'm sure many others online, people watching the video replays, will contribute as well. The website is posted in the chat. It's the Merrimack Valley Food Bank, mvfb.org, mvfb.org. Professor Sheila Heen, we thank you very much. We hope everybody buys the 3rd edition of Difficult Conversations when it comes out later this month. A wonderful hour. Thank you. And with that, we are complete.